Thank you very much, everyone, for attending this BritBanglaCovid public meeting. This is and I'm proud to say, our seventh BritBanglaCovid public meeting from the beginning of the lockdown. In fact, it will be useful for you guys, for those who are newcomers, to understand how BritBanglaCovid came about. And I'm very, very grateful that, to those who I can see in front of my screen who have actually taken part in shaping BritBanglaCovid as well. It was actually set up in the first month of the lockdown in April 2020 to understand really what was going on from the perspective of British Bangladeshis in Britain during the beginning of the pandemic. I had not realized that BritBanglaCovid is going to carry on thus far and do a broad range of things. And I'm proud to say BritBanglaCovid did so far collected over 30 individual stories of individuals. And as we know, with any forms of traumatic events, each an individual bring their personal experience to the pandemic. And what was interesting from my point of view is that individuals whom I've interviewed, they had similar kind of experiences, but of course, once the lockdown started, when the pandemic began, they had their own personal experiences to share as to how they deal with it. Some of them, unfortunately and sadly, have lost loved ones. Some of them lost their jobs. Some of them have excelled even. And that was interesting kind of to capture how each an individual had experienced during the lockdown. And I urge you to have a look, and it is for public record. Each and individual who had given their time to share their stories during the pandemic, they did it with their own permission, but they did it for the benefit of public record because it is a historical time. But of course, BritBanglaCovid did more than just capture individual stories. You also written a report during the pandemic, which was sent to all the councils in London, which had predominantly minority communities, and it did focus primarily on minority communities and initially looked at from the perspective of Bangladeshis and stories from the perspective of Bangladeshis. But of course, it went on, stories were very similar with other minority communities, with Pakistanis, Afro-Caribbean communities, knowing that many of the community members are working in the front line and living in overcrowded conditions. The question is, what could be done? So I urge you to have a look at BritBanglaCovid's website. You see it there. It's all there, leaflets, public meetings, and individual stories. But of course, it is also as important that members of the public actually get a thorough understanding of what has actually happened prior to the pandemic, during the pandemic, and most importantly, the way we are to move forward. But as a result of more than just the work of BritBanglaCovid, it's important that minority leaders, minority community members, and also individuals who work in a very predominantly minority local authorities and grassroots activists to share their experience, both on a professional capacity as well as personal capacity. This is why we have a broad range of leaders today to talk about those things, really. So, I mean, we have Patrick Vernon OBE, Rokhsana Fiaz OBE, Mayor of Newham. We have Rachel Blake, cabinet member for adult health and well-being, and of course Chris Tang, who has written a report during the lockdown around the Bangladeshi community, and Shirina Ali, who works at Limehouse, predominantly supports and advises on minority communities, and of course Abdi Hassan, who has a wealth of experience from the Somali background, really. So I don't want to say much, but I want those who are here to share their professional analysis and understanding, and hopefully after the talk, members of the public, you can ask questions, you can share your experience for the for policy development, as well as any future campaign purpose. So Patrick Vernon, I would like you to share us your thoughts. prior and currently, and of course, moving forward in the context of the pandemic and the minority communities.
Okay, thanks very much for inviting me. It's great to see quite a few familiar friends and allies. It feels like each time we have these Zoom events, we seem to be like revolving chairs, either talking about the impact of COVID or the vaccine uptake. And so it's great to see some familiar friends and allies. I mean, I don't want to rehash everything because all of us are aware of the consequences, the impact of COVID-19 on Black and racialized communities. From my perspective, I've actually worked in the field of public health and mental health for the last 20 odd years. I suppose one of the interesting parts of my career, I was actually senior director working in the NHS Commission of Healthcare in Northwest London, and then I spent 2 years in the Department of Health, part of a team of civil servants, where we put together the very first government strategy. This was back in 2003 on tackling health inequalities. Ironically, there was no strategy on health inequalities prior to them. There were programs of work, there were funding initiatives, there were targeted initiatives, but in 2003 was the first time any government put together a national strategy around tackling health inequalities. That led to a whole range of additional funding and resources and recognition that health inequalities was bad for your health, recognition between the causation of housing, the environment, a whole range of other factors, racism, domestic violence, has a key aspect around public health and health inequalities. And there was a significant number of investment that was put into public health programs up till the time of the coalition government in 2010, when essentially, as you know, because of austerity, and ironically, people don't talk about the impact of austerity in the context of COVID-19 and the vaccine uptake. This is quite significant because we have lost, especially in places like London and other parts of the country, we've lost intellectual knowledge, community knowledge, and money, which if that was still in place today, I'm not trying to say that we wouldn't have the devastation impact on our communities. I think the impact would be much less. You have to remember, just about over £1 billion have been cut just in public health budgets. I'm not even talking about mainstream local authority or NHS budgets. Just the money earmarked, ring fence for public health, we've lost that in the last 10, 12 years. And most of that money was actually targeting around big issues affecting Black and non-ethnic communities, stuff around diabetes, stroke, cancer, health awareness programs, community facilitators. We have lost that infrastructure over the last decade or so. And when you read any of these reports now that's come out, and every other week there's always a new report on COVID and BME communities. We've got more reports on BME community. I should stop using the word BME community, Black and racialized communities. We've got more reports on hot dinners, basically. And all the reports are saying the same key messages: more investment in community health, more investment in anchor organizations, more dialogue with communities in terms of outreach. But we had that, but we've lost it. We almost have to start all over again, and so that's part of the context. But obviously the biggest issue is, as you know, that in the UK, up to date, 150,000 people have lost their lives to COVID, 150,000 people. We don't actually know, the real numbers for communities. So I couldn't tell you how many Bangladeshis have died directly connected with COVID, or people in the African Caribbean community, the Pakistani community, or other communities. And one of the problems is, and all these data, and if you look at the reports done by, I think, Professor Kante from Warwick University, he was the first one that did a rapid review, before Public Health England started the work led by Kevin Fenton. And all these are kind of based on returns. So when someone is in a hospital setting, then that's the downtime they've recorded people's ethnicity. Because unfortunately, we don't record ethnicity in birth certificates. That was a campaign which a number of people, and I was involved in that campaign nearly 15 years ago, to have recorded ethnicity data on birth certificates. And because of the pandemic, now that's come to the fore, which is great. But sadly, if we had that in place, along with robust ethnic monitoring, then I think we'll have much better data and analysis. So all we have, for example, if you look at the pandemic, we had 2 waves. The first wave had probably had more of an impact on the Black community, and then the second wave had a massive impact on the Southeast Asian community, particularly the Bangladeshi and Pakistani community. But in between that, there were other communities who have been disproportionately affected anyway. So I think the Filipino community, I think if you were looking at like population per head, I think they were the most significant affected by the pandemic, particularly those who have been working in the NHS. And if you can, I don't know if you recall this, in the early days of the pandemic, and a lot of Filipino nurses were dying, and a number of them, because of their employment status, they didn't want to speak out because they were worried because of this hostile environment policy that we're under, that if they spoke out, then that would affect their status in Britain. But luckily, they had support from a whole range of mainstream professional bodies, as well as Black and multi-ethnic led medical bodies and professional bodies, and supported the Filipino community to share their stories of, so we've been disproportionately affected. And as we all know, that in terms of the first set of emerging deaths of frontline staff were from particularly Black and Asian communities. So we know that. At the time, if you remember, because the NHS was overstretched around the country, so they were launching these COVID hospitals. The first one was going to be Excel in Dockland, and then they're going to be rolled out the country. How much money have we spent on these failed hospitals? Because the Excel one only opened for a few months, and in the end, it became a vaccination centre, and it's closed down, basically. I was campaigning actually for the one in Birmingham because I thought that one could be named after Mary Seacole at the NEC, because what was quite clear was a lot of BME staff, Black and Northern staff, were dying on the front line. Some of them had underlying health conditions, but they were forced into ICU units. And one of the reasons why there's still, and I hate to use the word hesitancy, the reason why a lot of Black and Asian minority NHS staff have not taken up the vaccine is because of a long history of structural racism and bullying and harassment, and then you've been told you take the vaccine or else you're going to lose your job. I'm worried that we're going to lose a whole range of health professionals because of now they've been forced to take the vaccine. I do support the vaccine uptake, but I think there was a balance. And what was interesting watching the recent Sky News episode, if you saw that with the health secretary and a consultant who said, I've got enough antibodies, I don't need to take the vaccine. And maybe that's something that we need to explore. But definitely for frontline staff who have, and I've seen it myself because I sit on a number of NHS boards, so I've seen it myself, the history of bullying and harassment is something which has a factor. And again, this is one of the considerations, again, in terms of reports and also in the context of Black Lives Matter. But in terms of the one impact I want to focus on, because I know everyone's got a lot to say, is the impact of grief and loss within the community. When we die in our community, we have a rich history, a cultural, religious perspective of saying goodbye to our loved ones. And as you know, because of the social distance policy that was in place, we weren't allowed to have the burials, saying goodbye. People weren't allowed to go to hospital, say goodbye. So a lot of families up and down the country are still have not come to terms with the loss of grief. I mean, I lost a family member to COVID, and in my family, I can tell you, we're still trying to come to terms with that. There are some families who have lost multiple number of family members as well. And so so one of the things I decided to do, and I worked very closely with an organisation called Ubele, I launched the Majonti Fund. I'll put the details in the chat, because as I was reflecting of loss and grief in my family, which is no different to what was happening with other Black families, other Southeast Asian community families, and other religious families, how do you say goodbye to your loved one when you're not allowed to say goodbye to your loved one, basically? So I've launched this fund, the Majonti Fund. It's a Swahili word meaning grief, deep grief and sorrow. And I've raised just under £100,000, and we are giving grants to community groups and to individuals to look at different ways to say goodbye to loved ones. So we had the first round of grants we've given out already. We've just launched the second round, so I'll put the details in there. So please send the link, share the information, and we've given money for people to plant trees, park benches, people curating someone's life story, people, a whole range of things to commemorate people that lost. And I think the government does not respect and value our suffering in this context, basically. It's quite apparent now that with all these parties that were taking place last Christmas, a year ago, whilst we were all had to practice social distancing and the lockdown, flagrant disregard in terms of those families as well. That's the first thing. The second thing is about what do we do next? What's quite clear from a public health perspective, and the work that's been done by Kevin Fenton and a whole range of, and I think it's been fantastic. This is the first time I've seen so many Black and Asian public health doctors, professionals being given platforms for the first time, proper platforms on national TV, on radio, and in the media to let people know that there's a whole body of expertise and talent in our communities, and we have to own the solutions. Yes, we can. The government has its role to play. I'm sure Rokhsana will talk about the role of local government, but it's about our own agency. What are we going to do as whether you're a health professional, a community leader, or a concerned resident, or family member? We have to take control of shaping public health messages. We have to take control in the types of resources that we need to deliver a more holistic perspective around health and well-being. And more importantly, it raises lots of issues around accountability. Accountability of government at a national and local level, accountability at NHS at a national and local level. So I've just been appointed recently. I'm on the board of Birmingham and Solihull Integrated Care System, which is going to be the largest commissioning body when the white paper's passed in the next few months of commissioning healthcare across 2 local authority areas. And I want to use this opportunity to make sure that when we talk about health inequalities and structural racism, it's linked together. There has always been this dichotomy in public health policy that racism and racism and racial inequalities is spoken over there, and health inequalities is spoken over there. COVID has forced the two together, and any health system, which at a local level, at a national level, has to talk about health inequalities and racism at the same time. Not as an afterthought, it has to be integrated, and I think that is the future that we have to pursue and to push forward. The final thing I want to say is I work 1 day a week at the Centre for Aging Better, which is a think tank looking at aging in Britain, and we've done a piece of research work working with James Nasru from Manchester University and with Sussex University, looking at ethnic health inequalities as we get older. What's quite clear from the data, and we've got a seminar on Friday, and I'll put the details on the chat, is actually Bangladeshi and Pakistani communities are aging worse in the ages between 50 to 70. And if you add the fact of the pandemic, this is now a brand new long-term condition. It's estimated that 1.5 million people have long-term COVID. And I bet you majority, and there's a disproportionality of that from our communities as well. So now people might have to deal with hypertension, common heart disease, diabetes, and now COVID as a long-term condition. And again, it's about how we shape the types of health service that meets our needs. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Patrick. I know you mentioned lots of things. Please do put forward those links on the chat section so people can actually follow it up. Thank you.
Okay, we'll do, yeah.
Rokhsana.
Thank you very much, Ripon, and hi, everyone. Just really reflecting on what Patrick has said. I'm going to focus a lot of my commentary in the time that I've got as part of a contribution to this really important debate by really honing in on some of those fundamentals, and the exam question that's been asked of us as part of our contribution to this really important discussion has been, on reflection, what challenges have you experienced in relation to minority communities, either in the context of health, economy and messaging. And I guess I'll start by saying, and this links back to the systemic issues that haven't gone away, that Patrick has referenced. It's really important that we don't essentialise the conversation about COVID-19 as if there is something uniquely different or problematic about minority ethnic communities that has made it challenging in terms of a system response to their needs. And when I reflect on the last 2 years here in Newham, and the issues that we were contending with as it pertained to health inequity, this is pre-COVID, it was fundamentally understood that issues of health inequity are indelibly linked to issues of poverty and marginalisation, and if you don't address the issues of deprivation, poverty, economic inequality, you're not going to be able to sufficiently deal with the issues of health inequity. And prior to COVID-19, here in Newham, we had commenced work on that front through a fundamentally new and radical focus on addressing those systemic issues as it manifested for a majority of our community in this borough, which are made up of Black, Asian diaspora communities. So in the Newham context, some 78% of our resident population are from diaspora ethnic communities, either of origin or heritage. And even predating COVID-19, we had high rates of health inequity, and no doubt Rachel and her role now as the Cabinet Lead for Health and Adult Social Care, but also as the Deputy Mayor for Tower Hamlets, can attest the work that we were doing pre-COVID in order to get that systems focus. And the system is not just the local authority, the system is the integrated system as being advanced by various government policies in the North East London patch, which includes Newham and Tower Hamlets. And what we knew pre-COVID, we have significant percentage of our adult population exposed to, as a consequence of poverty and deprivation and inequality, issues of obesity, big issues of heart disease, diabetes, all those comorbidities and social determinants that exposed our community even more so when COVID-19 finally came. And just as another important point that I wanted to make, COVID-19 is going to be with us for a long time. And as we look ahead in contending with the ongoing challenges for our communities, not specific to any particular ethnic minority community, albeit we know that there are stark variations reflecting issues of profound disproportionality when it comes to particular ethnic minority groups. But we do have to contend with the impact of long COVID. We do have to contend with the low levels of third jabs as part of the booster programme. We do have to understand, recognise, respond to why is it that the majority of those that are currently in ICU wards in our hospitals in the North East London area, which includes Tower Hamlets and Newham, These are people that haven't been vaccinated, even with their first jab. I think the figures that I looked at on Friday were some 83% in the North East London area that are in ICU haven't had a vaccination. There are issues that we're going to need to continue working on, and these require considered and long and in-depth trusted conversations with not only influencers within those communities, but just also as a one-to-one. And, you know, for me, you know, moving forward, in addition to addressing the ongoing challenges around, you know, the immediate areas of concern for me as the Mayor of Newham, also the chair or co-chair of the Health and Wellbeing Board in Newham, is how do we ensure that the system works better to enable trust and confidence against the backdrop of a history of mistrust because of issues of health inequality and how people of colour have experienced the health system, and similarly about ensuring that the system, the border system, and integrated care and the approach absolutely has at its heart the focus on addressing those fundamental issues. And we also know that in part, as we potentially shift from a pandemic to an epidemic, management of COVID-19, which is the sort of national political conversation in government amongst some of the national experts. How do we manage that when we're starting from a much more challenging baseline because of the preceding and long existing issues of health inequality and inequality of access in the health system? So what does that require, and what does that require of me in demanding from the system that it provides and enacts and organisationally responds to that need? And then there are broader issues as it pertains to the economy. You know, we've got a significant section of our working age population working in quite insecure jobs. They are the most over indebted. You know, average rents in the borough represent 65% of average wages. We have highest overall level of homelessness in England when you take into account people who live in temporary accommodation. We've got 3 in every 10 of our school pupils eligible for free school meals. You know, these are all features of systemic issues of poverty, deprivation, inequality, and at its heart, given the characteristics of our resident population, we have to address, as Patrick has said, issues of race inequality, not just in the health system, but in the wider systems that our residents engage with. And, you know, just really by way of concluding, you know, despite the more severe impact of COVID-19 on specific groups, and in the Newham context, Black African, Black Caribbean, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, where we're seeing, you know, this play out very sharply. You know, we understand, and our experience over the last 2 years has deepened our understanding that the experience that they have is not equal, and their confidence to protect themselves as a consequence isn't equal either, because predating COVID-19, the system has let them down. So we've got to address those fundamentals of distrust and mistrust amongst communities of colour. And these have been long-standing issues. So I'm going to conclude there, but happy to pick up any specific questions during the course of this chat, but I trust that helps as a contribution.
Thank you, Rokhsana. Thank you very much. Rachel, do you want to kind of add to that based on what Rokhsana had just said?
Thanks, Ripon. Thanks, everybody, and good afternoon. Thank you for the invite, Ripon. It's always great to take part and have the opportunity to share ideas through this forum, through the BritBanglaCovid forum. I'll just build on some of what Rokhsana has said and just and reflect on Rokhsana and Patrick's comments about the impact of structural racism and how the pandemic has exposed the health inequalities that we already knew existed. As we all know, Tower Hamlets is a very diverse place, physically quite small, where community spaces really matter and different kind of community spaces really matter. And at the time, it feels completely weird now that we're coming up to 2 years since we all first started to think about COVID. But at the outset of the pandemic, there was a huge concern about the disproportionate impact that COVID would have on our community. And then I remember clearly over that summer, really wanting to work with grassroots community organisations around making sure that we would get some of that PPE and those very, very early prevention mitigation systems out into the community, and making sure that we were really working as close as we possibly could with community and grassroots organisations. But it was over that summer that Public Health England, and as led by Kevin Fenton, as Patrick's mentioned, started to do that work on disparities. And then that big piece of research came out demonstrating that the barriers to services are in place because of that structural racism, and how that would be embedded, and COVID would be completely exacerbated by those inequalities. And I think as what we learned is local government instinctively took the approach of working with the very grassroots, whether that was in the really early stages of setting up community hubs led by Black organisations or led by Bengali organisations as well. So in Tower Hamlets, we supported, nurtured community hubs led by those organisations to provide some of that immediate support to people. And then as the pandemic progressed, we then worked with those grassroots organisations to support people to engage with the test and trace systems that were being set up in that kind of summer to autumn of 2020. And we were looking at the other thing that has been really critical in our learning is looking at the different experiences of different Black, Asian and minoritized communities. And so recognizing the different experiences that Black African, Black Caribbean, Bengali, Pakistani communities will have, and that continues to be a real focus. So what I was going to emphasize was the learning from the pandemic and how in Tower Hamlets we want to put it into practice and use this as a way of tackling the ingrained health inequalities that we have now. And so really I would summarize our learning from protecting people and supporting people in the community during the pandemic as making sure that services are culturally competent in the very first instance, that are co-produced with communities, and that we take a communities first approach throughout. And that's something that we're continuing to do from a local authority perspective in our tackling health inequalities now. So during the pandemic, we've brought forward two big documents, big pieces of work. The first is our Black, Asian, Minority Ethnic Inequalities Commission, which looked in depth at health and the issues around trust that Patrick and Rokhsana have discussed, and also our health and wellbeing strategy, which puts taking anti-racist action at the heart of our health and wellbeing strategy, because it's only by taking those actions that we'll end the health inequalities that are so damaging for different populations and for our community. So what we have done in that, so to demonstrate our communities first approach, we have our COVID community champions, who are representatives from across Tower Hamlets, who meet every week and share their experiences, but also really advise the council on how to make sure we can get our public health messages out there and make sure that the lived experience is is really affecting how the council does its work in terms of vaccine take-up, engagement with the test and trace programme, and really listening to those community champions. We also have our ambassadors programme, which is local residents who are visible out on the streets supporting our community testing schemes, and in some of our testing locations, which we make sure are as visible and as grounded in our community as possible. We've ensured that there's been vaccine clinics in mosques, in community centres, in a range of places, so that we can make sure that vaccine take-up is as close to the community as it possibly can be. But now what we really want to do going forward is to really embed that approach, culturally competent, co-produced, and communities first. And so those community champions for COVID who are advising the council, challenging the council on how to make sure that those public health interventions are as effective as possible, we need to make sure that we're talking to those champions about the other public health challenges that we have, whether it's obesity, prevalence of diabetes increasing in the borough as well, and making sure that we have that kind of approach to tackling other public health challenges going forward, along with ambassadors who are grounded in the community and, as I say, challenging the council to take those anti-racist actions that will end health inequalities in the long term. I'll leave it there and look forward to questions.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you very much. I know we've talked about within the context of Tower Hamlets, and I know Shirina actually works at Limehouse Project, which is pretty much in the heart of Tower Hamlets. So Shirina, what have you seen on the ground?
Hi everyone, so I'm Shirina. I work at Limehouse Project, which is a charity organisation. We are based in the middle of Tower Hamlets, but we see residents from all over. So we give advice on, we give generalist advice on things like welfare benefits, debt, housing, immigration, pretty much everything and everything that comes through the door. We either give advice on, we share information, or we signpost or refer. The majority of our clients are Bengali or Somali, so they don't always speak English as the first language, maybe not IT literate, and don't really read and write English really well. So yeah, so our clients are quite vulnerable and have a lot of needs. Pre-COVID, a lot of our appointments were face-to-face, so we used to see clients that came to our door, or they came to appointments. We had never done telephone advice up till that point, so our clients were very much aware that they had to come to us to be seen, and we had never entertained the idea of telephone advice because we knew it was going to be very difficult for our clients. Obviously, when we went into lockdown, our advice changed, the way we approached everything changed, and we had to open up our advice line and give telephone advice. This meant that a lot of our clients couldn't access our services, couldn't access benefit advice, could not access any sort of advice from us because they just didn't know how they would be able to get advice from our advisors. At the same time, we saw a whole new group of clients come through, people who'd never accessed benefits before or didn't know anything much about applying for housing under council. So they were calling us for the first time, and we really we were seeing a whole different group of clients. In terms of our work, we saw a huge increase in benefit applications. The biggest one was universal credit because the people's circumstances had changed. People were on lower income than they were before, or they'd lost their jobs, or things have happened where they needed to now apply for a new benefit, and universal credit was the one they needed to apply for. But at the same time, there was a lot of misinformation in the community. People were being told to apply for universal credit when they didn't need to. People were making applications and then getting things wrong. So we were there to support them through that process. But that wasn't the only one. We saw a massive increase in applying for disability benefits as well, and for the council tax reduction discounts because of the income change in a lot of people's employment. We saw an increase in debt. Unfortunately, a lot of the debt that came through was rent arrears and council tax, which has consequences on the council tax bills. There was a lot of rent arrears that people had accumulated over a couple of months, and then sometimes we're seeing eviction notices or notice of seeking possession orders. So we saw an increase in those, but a lot of people were also unable to pay debt that they were previously paying off regularly, but suddenly, through no fault of their own, sometimes they could not pay these debts off and they needed help with those. We saw a massive increase in housing, about threefold increase in housing applications and housing advice. And this may be because people wanted to change the way they were living, or the circumstances had changed and they couldn't afford where they were living anymore. But we saw a huge increase in housing advice and housing inquiries. So this was a bit surprising for us because we weren't expecting that, and that did happen. Clearly, with COVID and what happened and what what Patrick was saying about the mental health effects of people grieving and going through COVID and long COVID, we saw an increase in clients with mental health issues. We made a lot more applications for mental health issues under personal independence payments and disability living allowances. We were expecting that because we were up to date with all the issues that were happening with long COVID, but still there was a massive increase. The only issue with our advisor services were that we didn't have funding for more advisors and more telephone appointments and things like that. So although there was a huge increase in our services being used, we didn't really have the capacity to deal with the number of people coming through our services. We also lost quite a bit of funding along the way, so our telephone advice decreased quite a bit. At the same time, we had to rely on volunteers to come forward and support us on our telephone lines, and we increased our volunteer services last year. This was an amazing thing for our volunteers to do for us because they were very dedicated, took quite a large number of phone calls, sometimes up to 25, 30 phone calls a day. And this was very different for us because we didn't really have a telephone service before pre-COVID. So this was a vital service that the volunteers were offering us as well. Bear with me while I go through my little list of things I wanted to say. We had a number of people come forward where they had relationship breakdowns. I mean, previously we had a lot of domestic violence victims come through. We had a lot of people come through when there was family breakdowns and things, but this was on another scale, and we had to support people with housing, with welfare benefits, with lots of emotional support as well. But it wasn't just people with relationship breakdowns. We saw people who'd lost their family members to COVID, who needed someone to talk to, and they picked up the phone and wanted to talk to an advisor who they knew previously, who they were familiar with, who they knew would not be judgmental, and just would listen to them. So we had to offer those services, even though that was not part of our overall work that we did. We were very proud to offer a food hub service in our venue at Limehouse Project. It became a central point to come to collect food, to collect vouchers, to collect some kind of support. For food was donated by the council, by the Gurdwara, by local residents. It was delivered by a wonderful project coordinator that we had, and a dedicated team of volunteers who worked for 2 years to keep this food hub going every Saturday. I think at some point we were giving out 300 meals every Saturday. And it's not scaled down by any means. I think taking away the £20 from universal credit, people not being able to go back to employment, the rising costs of living, things like that has really affected people's financial situation. So therefore the food hub has had to continue. So that's something we've looked at. Going forward, we are, like many organizations, we're not making long-term plans because long-term plans keep changing. I, for one, always thought that this pandemic was going to be over within 2 weeks. I mean, I left a chocolate bar in my desk hoping to go back. but things just didn't go the way a lot of us wanted things to go. So going into 2022, we will continue with a hybrid of face-to-face and telephone services. We will continue giving advice, workshops, delivering classes all online until we see it's safe. Like I said, a lot of our clients and our learners are from the ethnic minority group. They are vulnerable in so many ways, so we can't risk opening our doors in the way we want to. So we believe it will be a while before we go back to 2019 days and have drop-ins and things like that. But yeah, that's Limehouse Project, and that's our work.
Thanks, Shirina. Thanks. Abdi?
Yes.
What are your thoughts? Yeah.
To be honest, I think I think that Shirina captured almost an identical experience for us as a grassroots organization too. Now, the challenge that compounded COVID for us was, as we know, in the midst of the pandemic starting, we knew already that the worst outcomes experienced in Northeast London were minoritized communities. So we were already going into the pandemic with less and already the worst outcomes in public health with structural racism. But that was coupled with the brutal murder of George Floyd and of course the Black Lives Matter movement that started. And this was whilst globally, people of color and other groups were already facing deep trauma. So I certainly felt that at the tip of the pandemic and the impact on some of our clients, particularly the young Black men that we support. The deep poverty that I just spoke on is indicative of many communities in Northeast London, particularly where I live in Tower Hamlets, the Bengali and Somali community. And we know that through Sir Michael Marmo's report, which came out, and interestingly, just before the pandemic, he attended a session that was run by the local infrastructure organization. So we knew already that we have the highest obesity rates in the country in relation to our children, the highest ASB, one of the highest housing waiting lists in the country after Newham, and all the other different outcomes that already demonstrate the deep inequality and poverty that exists in our community. That was then coupled upon by the highest domestic violence rates in Tower Hamlets in relation to our minoritized communities, but also the highest substance abuse or misuse in the country, and now more and more the highest obesity levels. So we at a grassroots level are dealing with already changes globally where for once white organizations and white leadership were speaking about racism and creating safe spaces that we could speak on issues related to racism. But very quickly during the first wave, we lost quite a large amount of clients in Hackney to COVID, and mainly Somali women, all with underlying health, heart, diabetes, and other challenges too. But actually what I witnessed very quickly, and as an expert by experience, was the huge decline in mental health across all the cohorts of our young people, particularly our young people. And that really shocked me because we spent a lot of time fighting for our women, our groups of people who are most vulnerable. But actually it was our young people that just weren't able to communicate or be at school or be with their friends as part of their support networks. And then coupled in Hackney and certainly in Tower Hamlets and Newham, this rise in both police stop and search and just police brutality in general. I think the heightened community relations during the pandemic where young Black men were stopped and searched more than any other group. I think in fact in Hackney there was a 320% increase of stop and search, and where over 90% had no follow-up. As Shirina also said, we run a food co-op. We've been running the longest running food co-op in the country that Somali co-op managed for 4 years now. And we were originally supported by Fairshare, now Felix. And the huge increase is 125% increase year to date of food queues. And similarly, Newham, the Newham Food Bank has had the largest this past few months, increase in food poverty that we've ever seen. And we know that's supported by trust. I think somebody was agreeing with me, perhaps disagreeing with me, which is more the case quite often. But in Newham, we saw the food bank have the highest increase, and that was supported by the Trust report, which came out during that period, as well as the Joseph Rowntree Foundation report and many other reports, as Patrick said earlier. We recognized very early on, the first 6 months of the pandemic, that we would spend a lot of time shouting and screaming, certainly my side, at different leaders, mainly political leaders, leadership leaders like Councillor Rachel Blake and many other leaders, about the Somali community. But unfortunately, where we really suffered was data. And for many years, there's been a real lack of data around all of our minoritized communities, and that there are many reasons for that, but certainly my community around distrust, mistrust with councils, a concern around providing your personal information to census and other groups. And we know that because a cohort of our clients are also no recourse to public funds. So we're screaming that we need help, we still do, but how can we demonstrate that need? So we worked with LSE, my old university, and many other researchers, UCL, etc., to start to build. And we now have 2 reports, and we hope to have 1 more in the next month that we will present to Sadiq Khan and other leadership. But that really looks at the Somali community pan-London and the deep inequality that exists around housing, mental health, etc. And particularly the health inequalities that exists. And I'm really happy to hear that certainly in the Hamlets, there is now a focus on cultural competence, because for many years I've been screaming about providing safe spaces that are truly culturally competent and have meaningful co-production, rather than just, with great respect, white public health clinicians telling minoritized communities what they need. And Patrick is right, and I've got to that point of almost being doing this for a long while now in community, that actually we can't depend on structures to provide us with our answers, and we can't depend on structures to keep providing us with funding solutions. And Shirina said it perfectly, and as did Charity So White, that 8 out of 10 Black organizations certainly will have closing or will close in the next few months. And we know that because tragically an organization that I loved and had a lot of respect for, Bow Haven, where I live in Bow, also closed down. And the grassroots organizations are closing down at astronomical levels at the moment because of a lack of funding. So we know the need has increased, but the issue that we have is, how do we match that need if we don't have the money to match that need, and if we don't have the infrastructure support to match that need? And I fundamentally now genuinely feel like, although I have the answers, that it has to be us minoritized organizations and communities that must find those solutions ourselves in relation to mobilizing and also providing the advocacy, because we can't depend on structures anymore to do it, because we have the worst government on record, the worst and most racist government that is cutting services and budgets at never before seen records. So according to all the data sets, as I said, as per Marmo, as per the King's Run report, as per LAMI, as per Lini 2020, PCREF, and many other research papers, I think the next years will be very tough for our communities. And I think certainly in the third sector, we need to do more to work in partnership with other third sector organizations so that we find the answers within ourselves. And I'm hopeful that we will have much more equality and equity in funding in the third sector. And I hope to see that certainly through the integrated care system, although I've lost a lot of respect through that change, because so far we only have one mixed Black and heritage person who's CEO amongst the 42 ICS structures. And also I think more and more the concern around in our communities, enablers that are like the Race Commission enablers, or the report that allowed that report to be published during the height of the pandemic, that said apparently this country isn't structurally racist. So there's a lot that we need to do. There's a lot to be angry about positively. And I'm hopeful for my community, because I'm seeing more and more green shoots of community leaders and women, particularly in the services that we support, that are managing their own buildings, and we are less and less involved at a micro level and much more trying to regularly fight for funding and apply for funding. And as I said, I think it's about, perhaps certainly what I'm trying to do is have better dialogue and much more positive language with people that are influential, so that we can have a much more sustainable impact. But that's what I feel we have experienced. That's what I feel the Somali community have experienced, although I don't represent the entire community, of course. And that's what I know as an expert by experience, that we have a long way to go, but we remain positive.
Thank you, Abdi. Thank you. You said it very beautifully. Thank you. Chris, I know you've written a report recently around Bangladeshi. So what is your take on this?
Okay, well, I suppose, thank you first of all, Ripon, for inviting me, and thank you for keeping BritBanglaCovid going and bringing us all together again and again. Really good, really fantastic work. So I suppose my perspective is more on health communication, based on the projects I've been doing, working with Bangladeshi community and also other communities, Bahari speakers and Pashto speakers among them. So what really emerges from this work we've been doing at King's is a very familiar picture. Most of the information about COVID is in English and it's written, which creates an access issue. And that access issue relates to some people not being able to access this information because of English language, general literacy, digital literacy, health literacy. And what that situation creates is a community where some people can access the information, other people can't directly, which means social networks become absolutely vital in terms of how messages are disseminated. And that relates to the fact that a lot of the communities we've been working with speak or share an oral language. So an oral language is a language that is predominantly spoken, rarely written. And it's actually a very common phenomenon in the world. Most languages in the world, the oral language isn't a common thing that is shared by a lot of minority ethnic communities in the UK. And that has certain consequences, because an oral language is not something that is stable. It's not got dictionary, there's not a standardized variety. So you can't just translate into an oral language. And as we have a predominantly written information system in this country, the dominant information we communicating things information in is written. If I want to find out more information about the latest advice about the vaccine or about the pandemic, I can go online and I can find resources at trusted websites. But if that's not available to you, there is an inequality. And there's a lot of onus then being put on these social networks, which become more vulnerable to misinformation. So a lot of the research that we did focused on community elders, talking to people who don't normally get talked to. And some of them told us that the only person they got information during the first wave of the pandemic was a family member or a carer, one person. So if that person gets the wrong end of the stick somehow, then you're going to get the wrong end of the stick. And that creates a vulnerability, doesn't it? The other thing, of course, about oral language is that all of most of the information has come from a written way of understanding the world. And these written ways of understanding the world don't translate well into an oral language. The word droplet doesn't exist in Sylheti, for instance, on a lot of oral languages. Abstract concepts like support bubble don't translate very, very easily into other languages. The concept of household, upon which support bubble is based, the concept of household does not translate easily. It's a cultural construct. It doesn't exist in a lot of languages in the same way. So this means there's a very difficult process. You can't just have to completely reframe these messages and information about the virus. So really, we shouldn't be surprised if there was a delay in uptake of information. So I think vaccine hesitant was a really poor term. A lot of people weren't able to access information as quickly. They needed to rely on oral informational networks, which takes longer because we have a written informational system. There are trust issues that Abdi mentioned. And trust then needs to be generated locally and orally through these social networks. So it was always going to take longer. But now, as Ripon has pointed out, we've got this massive turnaround. So suddenly, after being labelled vaccine hesitant, UK Bangladeshis are, I believe, the most vaccinated ethnic group in London. That's a massive turnaround. So how did that happen? What have we learned from this? So what our data points to is that something called mediation has been absolutely crucial for this. Mediation is something we define as a process where you take information in one language, and then you don't just translate it, but you reframe it in a way that is accessible, intelligible, relatable, and also resonant in another language and to people from a different cultural background. And what we've seen is that there's been a lot of weight on grassroots mediation. Mediation's been happening on two levels. We've had grassroots mediation. So as I've mentioned, family members often acted as mediators, neighbors and so on, for people within the community. But we've also seen people come up and develop their own platforms. Ripon, for example, Jahangir Alom, right, is another example. People who've had a health background, creating their own platforms and reaching a wider range of people. And at the same time, that's worked in tandem with a lot of these professional, with what we could call maybe professional mediation, let's say. So, so Rachel mentioned the COVID community champions and the ambassador programs. These programs are fantastic. They create a link to the community, develop co-production and of shared understandings about what to do and what the vaccine represents and what to trust and who to listen to. So I think these are really important. We've seen things like that. We've seen these community-facing events with health professionals speaking local languages, listening to people's concerns about the vaccine, concerns about health advice, and being heard, and then going back to their communities and families and spreading the word. So we've been seeing basically what we've been seeing is a lot of messages going out into these social networks, people saying the same thing and people sharing that same message. The British Asian Network and Channel S have given mediators platforms as well. So we've seen the oral dissemination has suddenly become much more prevalent and much more consistent, so that if you are at the end of the information flow, you've got other people to listen to. So you're really addressing the imbalance created by a written system by boosting the oral system. One thing that's been absolutely fantastic about all of this, when you look at what mediators do, one of the things that you see a lot is testimony. People saying, this is what happened to me, this is what happened to my family member, and so on, to justify and explain why you're giving a certain amount of advice. And that's really, really important. Because stories, I mean, if you look at how our elders experience COVID, they talk about it in terms of stories. They don't talk about it in terms of high risk. I'm very clinically vulnerable, highly clinical. This doesn't make any sense for them. They talked about it as something that happened to people they knew, something that happened to their neighbor back home in Bangladesh, something that they are dealing with personally. And so we see people sharing stories in a way that promotes them. And what's great about stories is that they are very important for oral informational networks. Stories don't need to be written down in order for you to remember them. So they become very, very powerful ways of promoting messages and advice and ideas. So Ripon's work with these stories, I think, is really, really important. I think that's absolutely excellent. So it's a really shame that this sort of work, all of these initiatives, have not been as recognised as the health disparities and as the vaccine hesitancy of these ethnic minority groups. It seems that the media, it's really media worthy when ethnic minorities and health are connected in a negative way. But as soon as I haven't seen anywhere near as much reporting on this turnaround, which for me is really remarkable and newsworthy. How have they come from being vaccine hesitant to being the most vaccinated? So this is a bit of a shame, because I think it's really, really powerful and very important work. And I think that's the thing going forward, isn't it? We need to if we're going to take something from COVID, we've seen all these fantastic initiatives that have involved mediation, that have addressed these imbalances in how information and health information is disseminated in our society, and so we need to take it to other areas like obesity, for instance. Absolutely. And so we've got initiatives there, and I think I think one way we could boost current initiative is by trying to boost grassroots mediation by making it professional mediation. So if you can, for instance, we can talk about boosting the platforms of identifying grassroots mediators and promoting them and making them professional mediators, making them part of the informational systems. And I think the ambassador scheme and the community champions scheme seems to be something along those lines. I think they're really great. I think it needs to be part of emergency planning. Mediation needs to be factored in for whatever comes next as well. So we know how to communicate. We know how these systems work now. And I think from an academic side, I hear what Rachel was saying. We need to have co-produced action. So I don't think academics should be working in isolation. They should be working, as we have done on our projects, with activists and community researchers, with doctors from the community. And what we really need to work on at the moment is ways of improving not just the messages in not translating messages, improve the messages in English. So as Patrick said, take control over health messaging. So in ways that make messages easier to mediate, easier to translate cross-culturally and cross-linguistically. We've done some research on this based on Sylheti, but we need to do research with other languages and take a look at common ways of developing shared understandings about things like health, things like obesity, and obviously COVID. So I think I've said enough, so I'll end there.
Chris, thank you. By the way, if anyone wants to get in touch with Chris in the near future, please let me know. I'm happy to share. If Chris is okay about it, happy to share Chris's email, definitely. So really now, members of the public, it's up to you. Really. If you have any questions, or if you want to share your professional, personal experience, or if you want to ask questions to members of the panel, please do so. Feel free to just unmute yourself if you think that's easy and just blurt out whatever you have on your mind and fire away. Go ahead, Claudia. Hi, Claudia.
Thanks very much. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Claudia Cervetelov. I'm Bolivian, Latin American, migrant, and I work very closely with Latin American community in the UK. I'm a trade unionist as well, mental health therapist, and now I'm a councillor candidate for Victoria Ward. It's very exciting. And I say exciting because for me as a minority community, which of course I don't like the word minority, is hugely important. Our communities are represented in local government. Latin Americans, we are roughly, back in nearly 10 years ago, we were expected to be 250,000 Latin Americans, and now it's expected to be far more than that. And something that I find fascinating is that COVID has really exposed, as you all said, I'm not going to repeat it again, how the injustice of the language. And that's something that I feel very passionate about. So within our collectives and diaspora, we talk a lot about justice of the language, meaning that things need to be translated and need to be communicated in our own languages. I understand how, you know, an attack on our communities often is to say, why don't you learn English? And the thing is that we are living in a very hostile environment where English courses can be quite expensive, or they are required documents, and immigration, you know, policies are very hard. And this year is going to be even tougher for us, for our communities, because I don't know if you heard, but Priti Patel's policies on you know, the hostile policies are worsening, because in April they're going to request all members of the community, well, for everyone who rents a place, to show that they have the right to live in the UK. Otherwise, the landlords could face up to 5 years in prison. This is from the 6th of April this year. So this, on top of what's going on within COVID, is pretty crucial. So I wanted just to suggest that maybe one of the things that we could do, and I hope that if I'm elected, I would, and even if not, I will continue to push on this justice for the language, meaning that in the past, many years ago, the council did translate documents into languages that were spoken in the borough. I think that should happen in our communities. It's very difficult to expect, especially older adults, that, you know, start learning English. It's not easy, and our communities work really hard as well. We don't have those privileges as well on occasions. So I think if we were to push for that, would be great. And the other thing is about data. It's very difficult to know. We've done a lot of research for the Latino community. It's very difficult to know what are the issues that need to our communities if they're not on the data system, if we don't even know where they are. in the community. And of course, there is this trust, which I really like how you guys have explained that is true. But maybe another thing for us is to push for this and for us to show on the map, to show where our communities are. And the last thing, just the last comment, and again, another thing that hopefully will happen is community spaces. Community spaces is a huge issue for our communities. Buildings where we can go and congregate, celebrate, where we can organize, where we can empower each other, share our culture, and so on. So that would be, I think, something that I think would support, especially during the pandemic, as isolation, as you all have rightly said, is an issue. But justice of the language, I want to kind of plant that seed that hopefully stays with all of us. So I'm going to push on that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you. As usual, you're wonderful. Tanya, go ahead.
Thank you. My question is for Dr. Chris Tang. So Dr. Chris Tang has been talking about mediation in the process. So I was curious, did you find anything regarding what role the religious leaders played in, turning around the hesitancy to the, vaccinated kind of status? Was there anything that you could find in your report in relation to the religious leaders mediation? Thank you.
Hi, Tanya. Nice to see you here. Yes, I think yeah, absolutely vital. I think for a lot of what emerges from a data set with our older participants is that we have people had to reconcile this terrible pandemic with their religious beliefs. And on the one hand, this might lead to fatalistic attitudes, potentially, which the idea that, for instance, that you don't have any agency in determining your own health outcome because it will be decided by God. And on the other hand, we have people in the data talking about having a personal responsibility. So you earn God's protection by taking action and in terms of protecting yourself, by making sure your family are safe, that you earn that protection. And I think that those beliefs are very, very powerful in our data. And if you have somebody who speaks to those beliefs, so somebody who religious leaders who've come out and said that yes, no, this is something that you should do as a worshipper. So you should take the vaccine, or you should take these actions. It becomes quite convincing and quite powerful. So absolutely, religious leaders have been very, very important, I think.
Thank you, Chris. I hope that answered your question, Tanya. Fauzia, I know you've put a question on the chat section. Do you want to ask that, or do you think your question has been answered? Let me just repeat.
Hi there.
Hiya.
Hi everyone. It's been really great listening to everyone during the webinar. Yeah, I just put on the question, how do we keep this on the table? Because obviously, we've got this granular data, and I know it's not great for many areas. For instance, vaccine centers used to record ethnicity data. And I know in the Northeast, where I'm from, that's not happening anymore. And we're having to get that through public health, through the NHS records and the data that they're getting. And that's even coming quite late. So the action bit that we're doing, I'm part of the COVID control plan team. I'm working with public health in the Northeast and in Newcastle City Council, actually. So, we're getting that data quite late, but how do we keep, unfortunately, it's taken the pandemic to actually, bring this to the forefront. How do we keep it on the table?
Okay, I know Rachel is leaving. Rachel, do you want to start? Do you want to kind of say your bit?
Thanks, Ripon. I just wanted to mention again those two documents that I talked about in terms of our Black, Asian and minoritised inequalities commission, which had a really clear action plan, but also we have written it into our health and wellbeing strategy, which is a document that will be held accountable for the next few years. And so when we are asked to report back on that in a public setting, because it's held by our Health and Wellbeing Board, which is a statutory bit, that's something that we'll have to be held accountable for. And I think the way to keep this issue at the forefront is by getting it into some of those statutory documents and constantly demanding that that there's demonstrable actions have been taken through those documents that are just there, and people have to demonstrate what they've done about it. And thank you very much for having me. I'm going to log off at 4:30, but I've really enjoyed the session and have, as ever, found it inspiring and quite energizing. So thanks, Ripon, for bringing us together.
Thank you, Rachel. Now, Rokhsana, go ahead.
So I was really struck by what Abdi was saying in his contributions earlier as part of this really important debate. And I think there's absolutely a role and an advocacy role on part of Black, ethnic, marginalised group organisations in this arena, and many others, not just in health, but in the arenas of economics. I think there's absolutely an advocacy role that local government and councils and council leadership plays, both in terms of the political leadership, but also the officer leadership. And, you know, in the context of Newham, we've made it absolutely clear that corporately, through our Towards a Better Newham Recovery strategy in response to COVID-19, which builds on a whole raft of strategies that was a response to issues of marginalisation, deprivation, inequality, structural racism, that's the lens through which the organisation in its entirety views these things. And part of that will require a learning in order to do the practice of looking at all of these social and economic issues through the lens of racial marginalisation. You know, we've got a staff team of 5,000 people, and instilling and training them, you know, how to apply that lens and live and breathe it is a massively significant feat, but we've started. And also it requires of both that officer core leadership within the council and that political leadership within the council to perform that advocacy role with all of our partners within the broader system. And, you know, there was a question that you raised around how can we get access to that data quickly. It's a perennial question that my public health team are asking our health partners, because I equally, as does the Cabinet Member for Health and Adult Social Care, you know, daily ask, where are the numbers, where's the data? Because if you do not have access to that granular data as it pertains to specific communities within your locality, you're not going to be able to engineer and shift the system so it's as responsive and agile as it needs to be where there are weaknesses. So, for example, we now know that in the Newham context, you know, vaccination and booster focus, where that needs to be amongst specific ethnic communities, but also geographies. And if we are understanding of the geographies, because of some of that data, which does come at a delayed pace, and that's not good enough, it also prompts and opens up an important strategic question with health partners as part of that wider system. You know, it necessitates a more hyperlocal presence for this and other health requirements for our communities, be that you know, clinical response to clinical health needs, but also mental and health and well-being. And just to say, by way of finalising, the way in which we're institutionalising and embedding all of this is through our health and well-being, through our Towards a Better Newham corporate plan, which is de facto the manifesto that the organisation has to not only subscribe to, but demonstrate through our evaluation performance outcomes based framework that it is delivering to. We place health, well-being and happiness of our residents, but we've also placed racial inequality at the heart of that corporate plan.
Thank you, Rokhsana. Now, Patrick, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So kind of building on the last 2 points. So I'm a campaigner and an activist, and I've been involved working with a number of organisations trying to put pressure on this government to recognise racial disparity and structural racism. So at the height of the pandemic, worked closely with the Runnymede Trust, UBELE, and a number of organisations. We put together a letter which a number of Black and minority ethnic health professionals, people in public life, demanding a public inquiry on racial disparities and COVID-19, as well as there's the bereaved family COVID family network who have been campaigning for a public inquiry. And I think with those and also pressures from a whole range of individuals, there will be a public inquiry. We have to influence that public inquiry. Currently, they're actually looking at the terms of reference, and we've got to make sure in terms of the terms of reference, and it'd be great, I think, in terms of ROCs and the work that you're doing and how we can influence the local government community and the LGA, that we put pressure on the government to recognise that racial inequality, structural racism has to be in that terms of reference. If it's not in that terms of reference, then they'll just be looking at things and disregard all the efforts and issues that we've been talking about, not on this call, but on the previous calls and all the reports that's been done. That's the first thing. The second thing is Marie Curie. I've been working closely with Marie Curie over the last year or so. They launched last year for the first time on 23rd of March, National Reflection Day. That day is about reflecting on loss, not necessarily connected directly to COVID, but loss. It's been the pandemic for the first time has made this country start talking about loss and grief in a meaningful way. It's not, whereas loss and grief was always personalised about my family, but we've had a kind of conversations, people writing, like Ripon, you talked about people sharing their stories of lockdown. More and more people want to share their stories of lockdown, grief, loss, depression, isolation, and all of that, given that permission to do so. So the next National Reflection Day is taking place this year, 23rd of March, and it'd be really fantastic for organisations to use that opportunity on that day to tell their story of loss, grief, the impact of the pandemic, etc. I think it's really important. Sometimes we're too silent. We are made to feel that our voice is not valued and respected, but we have a story to tell. We have narratives to tell. So I think that's quite important. Thirdly, I've put in the chat about the Majonti Fund. Please, we want to have more communities to apply and individuals and families to apply to use the opportunity to acknowledge and celebrate the loss of their loved ones and that permission that we have, basically, as well. And I think also it's unfortunate the race disparity report was designed deliberately to kill off any talk around structural racism. It actually backfired because we actually talk about it even more so. And what we need to do, there has to be, from a civil society perspective, some kind of all the key organisations around faith groups, race equality groups, need to come together in a powerful voice to say to this government, enough is enough. I mean, the Labour Party, and through the work of Doreen Lawrence, she did a report on COVID that came out last year. One of the recommendations is to have a new Race Equality Act. The current legislation has been deliberately declassified by this government. We need to have strong powers, effective powers, and resources around this delivery. And there are some key basic public health stuff that needs to be done. We need to have legislation to make sure that we record ethnic monitoring on birth and death certificates. I think that's really critical for future planning and basic benchmarking of data for the future. We need to have more resources for community public health at a local level and national level. We need to make sure that the Black and non-ethnic professionals, doctors, nurses, researchers, are respected in their work and not being fobbed off and marginalised as well. And I think fourthly, we need to influence the new commissioning world that's taking place around the ICSs, which will have large commissioning budgets in partnership with local government. And we need to make sure that they take on board issues around race equality and structural racism as well. That's just my start for 10.
Any more questions or contributions? Patrick, you seem to have your hand up still. Do you want to carry on?
No, that was it.
Okay. I think you've killed it. There we go. You killed it. Well, it's also a good time to actually end, because we did say it will carry on up to 4:30, so an hour and a half. I think that's probably more than enough if we all agree. So do you all agree? Fantastic. So on that note, I would like to thank everyone, members of the public and the panelists, for attending. And I'm very grateful for helping us to carry on with the campaign, really. And hopefully it's not the ending, but we have a long way to go. So apart from that, thank you very much. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.